The walk-in freezer at the Harbor View was the only place in the entire restaurant where the noise of the dinner rush died down, replaced by the low, steady hum of the compressor. It was supposed to be where I cooled down after 12 hours over a scorching grill, a sanctuary of frost and silence. But when I pushed open the heavy steel door that Tuesday night holding a crate of produce, the silence was broken by a sound that would shatter my life. The soft, stifled whimpers of my wife Savannah pressed against the metal shelving by my best friend Mason. They didn't hear the door open. They were too lost in the heat they had created in that freezing room. If stories about the brutal reality of betrayal, the quiet dignity of walking away, and the cold calculation of long-awaited justice resonate with you, stay with me. This isn't just a story about cheating. It's about the cost of ambition and the terrifying power of a man who has nothing left to lose. The air in the kitchen of the Harbor View was thick enough to chew. It smelled of seared scallops, old fryer oil, and the sharp metallic tang of stress. "Order up table 12, I shouted, slamming a plate of sea bass onto the stainless steel pass. My voice was hoarse scratch raw from shouting over the roar of the exhaust hoods for the last 10 hours. "Pick up, let's go!" Mason's voice boomed from the other side of the pass. He stood there in his pristine Navy suit, checking his watch, looking every bit the general of an army he didn't have to bleed for. "Jake, faster on the risotto. VIPs are waiting." "It's coming, Mason. Give it 30 seconds. I grunted, wiping sweat from my forehead with the back of my sleeve. My hands were a map of burns and callus, the hands of a man who worked for a living. Mason's hands were manicured soft. We had grown up on the same block, played ball in the same parks. But inside these walls, he was management and I was labor. Savannah breezed past the station, balancing a tray of martinis. She caught my eye for a second, just a second, and gave a tight, tired smile. "Hang in there, baby," she whispered, her blonde hair escaping her bun in wisps that framed her flushed face. "Shift's almost over." "Yeah," I said, flipping a steak. "Almost over." I loved her. God, I loved her. We were struggling, drowning in student loans and rent for a shoebox apartment in Pilsen, but I told myself it was temporary. Mason had promised me the head chef position once Old Man Miller retired next year. We were a team, the three of us. At 9:30 p.m., the rush finally broke. The ticket machine stopped its relentless chattering. "I need more heavy cream from the walk-in," I told the sous chef, wiping my knife. "Cover the line." I stepped out of the inferno of the kitchen into the narrow hallway leading to the back. It was cooler here, quieter. I walked toward the heavy steel door of the walk-in freezer, the sanctuary where we kept the expensive proteins and the backup produce. I didn't mean to be quiet. It was just the rubber soles of my non-slip shoes on the greasy tile. I reached for the latch, the cold metal biting into my palm. I pulled the door open. The rush of sub-zero air hit me first, turning the sweat on my face to ice. Then the image hit me. They were pressed against the metal shelving right next to the crates of imported lemons. Savannah's back was to the shelf, her legs wrapped around Mason's waist. Her head was thrown back, her eyes closed, a sound escaping her throat that I had only ever heard in our bedroom. Mason's hands were gripping her hips, his suit jacket discarded on a box of lettuce. Time didn't stop. It shattered. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The hum of the compressor was the only sound in the world. Then Mason turned his head. His eyes met mine. There was no fear in his eyes. There was annoyance. "Jesus, Jake," Mason said, breathless, not even stepping away from my wife. "Knock, will you?" Savannah gasped, scrambling down, pulling her skirt down with trembling hands. Her face went from ecstasy to horror in a split second. "Jake! Oh God, Jake!" I stood there holding the door handle. I should have lunged at him. I should have screamed. I should have done something that matched the nuclear explosion happening inside my chest. But then Mason scoffed, a small dismissive sound. "Well, don't just stand there with your mouth open. Close the door. You're letting the cold air out." He looked at me like I was an employee who had made a mistake. Not a friend, not a husband, just the help. I looked at Savannah. She was looking at the floor, unable to meet my gaze. "Jake, please," she whispered. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, not from fear, but from a sudden violent clarity. I was the cook. He was the manager. She was the prize. I was simply in the way. I didn't say a word. I stepped back and let the heavy steel doors slam shut, sealing them back inside their cold, secret world. I turned around and walked back toward the kitchen. The noise of the line, the shouting, the clatter of pans, it all sounded distant now, like it was happening underwater. I walked to my station. I untied my apron, the one stained with tomato sauce and grease, the uniform of my life for the last 7 years. I folded it neatly. I placed it on the counter next to the unfinished risotto. "Jake, where are you going?" the sous chef asked, confused. "We got tickets." I looked at him, then at the swinging doors of the restaurant where the customers were laughing and eating, oblivious to the fact that my life had just ended. "I'm done," I said. My voice was steady, terrifyingly steady. I walked out the back door into the alley, into the humid Chicago night. I didn't have my coat. I didn't have my car keys. I just walked. And I knew with every step I took away from the harbor view that the man named Jake Montgomery was dying tonight. Someone else was going to have to take his place. My phone started buzzing against my thigh before I even made it to the end of the alley. It vibrated like an angry insect, relentless and demanding. I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. It would be Mason, first trying to do damage control, trying to spin the narrative before I had time to think. Then it would be Savannah crying, panicked, realizing that her safety net had just walked out the door. I reached into my pocket, silenced the device, and kept walking. I didn't throw it away. Not yet. I needed the silence more than I needed the dramatic gesture. The walk from the harbor view to our apartment in Pilsen usually took me 40 minutes on the train, but that night I walked. I walked until my feet blistered in my non-slip work shoes. I walked until the smell of the river faded, replaced by the exhaust fumes and asphalt of the inner city. I needed the physical pain to distract me from the image burned into my retinas, her head thrown back, his hands on her hips. By the time I reached our building, it was nearly midnight. The apartment was dark. It smelled of vanilla and fabric softener, Savannah's smell. It was a scent that used to mean home safety and rest. Now it smelled like a lie. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the small living room by the light of the street lamps filtering through the blinds. I looked at the life we had built, the IKEA sofa we had assembled together, laughing over the missing screws, the framed photo on the wall from our wedding day where I looked like the luckiest man in Chicago, and she looked like she was settling. I saw it now. In the shadows of the room, I saw what I had been too blind to see in the light. The way she looked at Mason at the Christmas parties. The way she complained that my clothes always smelled like grease. The way she talked about ambition as if it were a currency I was too poor to afford. I went into the bedroom and pulled my old gym duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. I didn't pack clothes. I didn't pack the shirts she had bought me or the shoes she liked. I packed only what was mine before her. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 plain t-shirts, my comfortable boots, a hooded sweatshirt. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror. The lines around my eyes were deep for a 28-year-old. I looked exhausted. I looked used. "You're done," I whispered to the reflection. "Jake the cook is dead." I walked back to the kitchen. The phone in my pocket buzzed again. I ignored it. I looked at my left hand. The gold band was simple, scratched from years of gripping knife handles and scrubbing pans. It had never really fit right. It was always a little too tight, choking the circulation in my finger. I gripped the ring. It resisted, stuck on the knuckle, as if the metal itself was trying to hold me to this life. I twisted it hard, ignoring the friction burn until it slid off. The skin underneath was pale, raw, and indented, a ghost of a commitment. I placed the ring on the center of the kitchen table. I didn't leave a note. What was there to say? "I saw you. I hate you"? No. Words would just give them something to analyze, something to twist. Mason would find a way to make my words sound crazy. Savannah would use them to play the victim. Silence was the only weapon they couldn't counter. I grabbed the duffel bag and walked to the door. I took one last look at the apartment. It looked exactly the same as it had this morning, but it felt like a museum exhibit of a tragedy. I opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and locked it from the inside. I slid the key under the mat. When I walked out onto the street, a taxi was just letting a passenger out. It was fate. I climbed in. "Where to?" the driver asked, eyeing my duffel bag and my grim expression. "Union Station," I said. "Catching a late train?" "Something like that." I replied, turning to watch the building disappear into the darkness behind us. My phone buzzed again. This time I took it out. I powered it down, pulled out the SIM card, and rolled down the window. The little piece of plastic tumbled onto the Kennedy Expressway, lost instantly in the rush of traffic. I sat back and closed my eyes. I had $60 in my wallet and a bank account I would drain as soon as the sun came up. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I wasn't coming back. I didn't leave Chicago. I just went low. I went to the parts of the city where names didn't matter, only cash did. I found a room in a motel off I-55, a place where the carpet was sticky with spilled beer, and the walls were thin enough to hear the truckers coughing in the next room. For the first month, I didn't cook. I couldn't stand the sight of a knife or the smell of heating oil. Instead, I found work at a logistics yard near the canal, hauling crates and loading pallets from dawn until dusk. It was brutal, mindless work. My hands, once trained for the delicate precision of plating, microgreens, were now wrapped in cheap leather gloves, blistering and bleeding, as I heaved 50-pound boxes of auto parts. I welcomed the pain. The physical exhaustion was a narcotic. When my back screamed and my shoulders burned, I couldn't think about Savannah. I couldn't hear the sound of her whimpering in the freezer. I just worked until I was hollow. Then I went back to the motel, drank cheap whiskey, and passed out. But ghosts are hard to kill, especially when you are the ghost. 3 weeks in, on a rainy Tuesday, my resolve cracked. I walked to a public library 3 miles from the motel. I sat down at a computer terminal smelling of rain and industrial grease, and I logged into a burner Instagram account I had created. I told myself I just wanted to see if they were looking for me, if there were missing person posts. If Savannah was worried, there was nothing. I navigated to Savannah's profile. It was public. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The most recent photo was posted 2 days ago. It wasn't a plea for my return. It was a picture of a new menu item at the Harbor View, a risotto dish. My risotto dish. The caption read, "New season, new flavors. So proud of our team for stepping up. Hashtag Harborview, hashtag Fresh Start." I clicked on the tagged users. There was Mason tagged in the photo. I went to his profile. He had posted a photo of the staff meeting. He was standing at the head of the table, my table, wearing a new suit. Savannah was sitting to his right, holding a clipboard, looking attentive and professional. She didn't look devastated. She didn't look like a woman whose husband had vanished into thin air. She looked relieved. I scrolled back. They had waited exactly 1 week after I left to promote Mason to general manager and announce a restructuring of the kitchen. They hadn't reported me missing. They had likely told everyone I quit that I couldn't handle the pressure that I walked out on them. They had spun the narrative perfectly. I wasn't the victim. I was the flake who abandoned his wife and job. I sat there in the quiet library, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't a loud snap. It was the quiet sound of a bridge collapsing. I had been waiting for them to feel guilt. I had been waiting for the universe to punish them. But the universe didn't care. They were winning. They were sleeping in my bed, eating my food, and erasing my existence. I logged out. I wiped the browser history. I walked out into the rain. I didn't feel the cold anymore. The sadness that had been weighing me down for weeks began to evaporate, replaced by something heavier, colder, and much more useful. I wasn't going to just survive. I wasn't going to be a warehouse mule for the rest of my life, watching them live the life I built from the shadows. I needed money. I needed leverage. And I needed to stop thinking like a cook and start thinking like the people who own the cooks. The next morning at the logistics yard, I didn't just lift the boxes. I started looking at the shipping manifests. I started watching how the foreman organized the trucks where the inefficiencies were where the money was being wasted. I wasn't Jake the cook anymore. I was something else entirely, and I was just getting started. It was a Tuesday in November when the black Mercedes G-Wagon pulled onto the muddy lot of the distribution center. It looked like a spaceship landing on a landfill. The tires were polished, the windows tinted deep obsidian, and it stood in stark contrast to the rusted forklifts and the sea of gray shipping containers. I was securing a tarp over a stack of drywall when the driver's door opened. A woman stepped out. She was small Asian American, dressed in a sharp beige trench coat that probably cost more than my entire year's wages as a cook. She wore oversized sunglasses and held a set of blueprints rolled under her arm. This was Sarah Chen. I didn't know her name then, but I knew her type. She was the money. She was arguing with Miller, my foreman. Miller was a large man with a red face and a habit of padding the invoices. He was pointing at a stack of timber, his hands waving in the air, performing the theatrics of a man caught in a lie. "I'm telling you, Ms. Chen, the shipment was delayed at the rail yard," Miller shouted over the noise of a reversing truck. "It's a supply chain issue. Nobody can get that grade of cedar right now. We have to use the treated pine, or we miss the deadline." I stopped pulling the bungee cord. I knew that shipment. I had logged it in myself 2 days ago. It wasn't stuck at the rail yard. It was sitting in container 402, hidden behind a wall of scrap metal, because Miller had already sold half of it to a side job he was running in Naperville. I should have kept my head down. The old Jake, the nice guy who just wanted to make risotto and go home to his wife, would have kept his head down. But that guy was dead. The man standing in the mud had nothing to lose and a burning need to see a liar get caught. I walked over. My boots were caked in mud, my hoodie stained with grease. "He's lying," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like a knife. Miller spun around, his face turning a darker shade of crimson. "Get back to work, Montgomery. This doesn't concern you." I ignored him and looked directly at the woman. She had taken off her sunglasses. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, assessing me not as a person, but as data. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said he's lying," I repeated, pointing toward the far end of the lot. "The cedar arrived 48 hours ago. It's in container 402. He hid it because he's planning to load it onto his brother's truck tonight. Check the manifest logs. I signed for it at 6 a.m. on Sunday." Miller lunged at me. "You shut your mouth, you piece of trash." But Sarah raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. She didn't look at Miller. She looked at me. "Show me." I let her pass the furious foreman weaving through the maze of crates to container 402. I popped the latch and swung the doors open. The smell of premium aromatic cedar filled the damp air. It was stacked floor to ceiling, stamped with the supplier's logo. Sarah looked at the wood, then at Miller, who had followed us looking pale and sick. She didn't yell. She didn't make a scene. She just pulled out her phone. "You're fired, Mr. Miller," she said calmly. "Leave the site before I call the police for theft." Miller sputtered, cursed, and stormed off. Sarah turned back to me. She looked at my dirty gloves, my worn-out boots, and then up to my eyes. "You're the new guy, the quiet one." "Jake," I said. "Well, Jake," she said, tapping the blueprints against her palm, "you just saved me $50,000 in a week of delays." "Why, I don't like thieves," I said, "and I don't like being treated like I'm blind just because I work with my hands." She studied me for a long moment. "You read the manifest, that's not your job." "I read everything," I replied. "Patterns, numbers, logistics. It keeps my mind busy." "And what did you do before you were hauling drywall?" "I was a chef," I said. "I managed inventory cost analysis and waste reduction. I know how to run a tight ship." She nodded slowly, a small smile playing on her lips. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a predator recognizing another predator. "I don't need a chef, Jake, and I don't need a laborer anymore, apparently," she said, handing me a business card. "I need someone who pays attention to the details that everyone else misses. Wash up. Come to this address tomorrow morning. Wear a suit." "I don't have a suit," I said bluntly. She reached into her purse, pulled out a clip of cash, crisp $100 bills, and pressed it into my dirty gloved hand. "Then buy one," she said. "Don't be late." The suit cost $600. It was charcoal gray wool, and it felt like armor. Standing in the dressing room of the department store, I looked at myself in the three-way mirror. The man staring back wasn't Jake, the line cook. The grease burns on his neck were covered by a crisp white collar. The despair in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I didn't recognize him, and that was exactly the point. Working for Sarah Chen wasn't a job. It was a demolition of my former self. Her office was a glass box on the 45th floor of a skyscraper in the Loop overlooking the sprawl of Chicago. On my first day, she didn't give me a desk. She gave me a stack of zoning laws, tax code manuals, and distressed asset reports that reached my waist. "You understand how a building is put together physically," Sarah said, standing by the window, not looking at me. "Now you need to understand how it's put together financially. If you can't find the invisible cracks in the ledger, the physical cracks in the foundation don't matter. I studied. I treated finance like I used to treat a complex recipe. I broke it down to its base ingredients: leverage, equity, cash flow, risk. I stayed in the office until 2 a.m. every night. I slept 4 hours, drank black coffee, and did it again. I replaced the muscle memory of chopping onions with the mental gymnastics of calculating capitalization rates. For the first year, I was an imposter. I sat in meetings with bankers who had degrees from Wharton and Harvard men who had never had dirt under their fingernails. They looked at me with suspicion. They smelled the blue-collar roots on me. But I had something they didn't. I knew what things actually cost. When a contractor tried to quote us triple for HVAC installation, I knew he was lying because I used to unload those units. When a developer claimed a foundation was solid, I knew where to look for the water damage. I became Sarah's grim reaper. She pointed me at a project, and I dissected it. By year 3, the imposter syndrome faded. My hands healed. The calluses softened, but the skin grew thicker in a different way. I stopped flinching when Sarah destroyed a competitor. I learned that in this world, mercy was just bad business. I also learned how to bury Savannah. There were nights, usually after a 12-hour day, when I would sit in my high-rise apartment, a sterile, modern place, with no pictures on the walls, and the old ache would return. I would wonder if she was happy. I would wonder if Mason treated her well. One night, drunk on expensive scotch, I almost drove past the harbor view. I made it 2 blocks away before I slammed on the brakes. I sat there gripping the leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. "No," I said to the empty car. "Not as a spectator, never as a spectator." I turned the car around. I wasn't going back until I could buy the street they walked on. By year 5, I was a partner at Chen Capital. I had my own portfolio. I had successfully redeveloped 3 city blocks in the West Loop. I was wealthy, respected, and entirely alone. One Tuesday morning, Sarah called me into her office. She looked older now, tired, but her eyes were still sharp. She slid a file across her mahogany desk. "The waterfront project," she said. "The city is finally approving the rezoning for the North River District. We have the capital to move, but there's a holdout, a key property right in the center of the development zone. If we don't get it, the whole project dies." I opened the file. My heart stopped, then restarted with a slow, heavy thud. There, clipped to the front page, was an aerial photograph of a familiar building. The red brick facade, the patio overlooking the river, the Harbor View restaurant. "The current owners are over-leveraged," Sarah explained, unaware of the war drumming in my chest. "They're barely making interest payments. Management has been sloppy for years. It's ripe for a hostile takeover." I looked at the financial statements included in the file. I saw the declining revenue. I saw the bloated payroll. I saw Mason's name listed as general manager, his signature on the failing quarterly reports. A smile touched my lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who had just found the final piece of a puzzle he had been building for 5 years. "I know this property," I said, looking up at Sarah. My voice was calm, terrifyingly void of emotion. "Let me handle the acquisition." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You seem personally invested, Jake." "I just know the value of the land." I lied smoothly. "I can get it for us. Cheap." "Do it," she said. I closed the file. The education was over. The execution was about to begin. I parked the Aston Martin a block away. It was a conscious choice. I didn't want the valet to see my face yet. I wanted to walk the final 100 yards. The Chicago wind whipped off the river, cutting through the lapels of my cashmere coat. But it felt different now. 5 years ago, the cold had felt like poverty. Now it just felt like weather. The neon sign of the harbor view flickered. The V was buzzing intermittently, a small defect that drove me crazy the moment I saw it. It was a sign of negligence, a sign of cash flow problems. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors, the front entrance, a threshold I had rarely crossed as a cook. The warmth hit me, carrying that familiar scent of garlic wine and expensive perfume. But underneath it, my trained nose caught something else, the faint, sour smell of a dirty draft beer line. Details. They were slipping. The hostess station was manned by a girl I didn't recognize. She looked bored, scrolling on her phone. "Reservation?" she asked without looking up. No, I said. My voice was deeper than it used to be practiced in boardrooms. Table for one, somewhere quiet. She finally looked up, assessing the coat, the watch, the shoes. Her posture straightened instantly. Of course, sir. Right this way. She led me to table 4, a semi-private booth near the wine wall. It offered a panoramic view of the dining room while keeping me obscured in the shadows. It was the perfect vantage point. I ordered a sparkling water and opened the menu. It was the same layout as 5 years ago, but the prices had hiked 40%. Desperation math. Then I saw him. Mason walked out of the kitchen swinging doors. He had gained weight. The sharp jawline was buried under a layer of indulgence, and his suit, though expensive, looked strained at the buttons. He was snapping his fingers at a busboy, his face flushed with irritation. He looked like a man trying to hold on to water with a clenched fist. And then I saw her. Savannah emerged from the bar area carrying a tray of drinks. She was still beautiful objectively, but the light behind her eyes was gone. There was a hardness to her mouth, a tension in her shoulders that screamed exhaustion. She wasn't the glowing prize Mason had stolen. She was just a woman working a shift, trapped in the consequences of her choices. She walked right past my table. My heart didn't race. My hands didn't shake. I felt a strange clinical detachment. I was looking at strangers. "Here you are, sir," she said to the table next to me, placing the drinks down with a practiced fake smile. She turned and her gaze swept over me. For a split second, our eyes met. I held my breath, waiting for the shock of recognition, waiting for the tray to crash to the floor. But she just looked through me. To her, I was just another suit, just another rich man in the shadows. I had changed too much. The beard, the haircut, the clothes, the posture. I was a different species than the husband she had betrayed. She gave me a polite, empty nod and walked away. The realization washed over me like ice water. I am invisible. It was the ultimate power. They didn't know the executioner was already in the room. A waiter approached my table. "Are you ready to order, sir?" I looked at the menu one last time. I saw the signature risotto listed. My recipe, the one I had perfected over 3 years of trial and error. "I'll have the risotto," I said, "and tell the manager I'd like a word when he has a moment. Tell him I represent the new ownership group for the building." The waiter's eyes widened. "The ownership group?" "Yes," I said, unfolding my napkin calmly. "I'm here to inspect the asset." The waiter scurried off toward Mason. I watched as he whispered in Mason's ear. I saw Mason go still. I saw him look toward my table, squinting into the dim light. I picked up my glass of water and raised it slightly in his direction. Showtime. Mason adjusted his tie as he approached table 4. I watched him through the reflection in my water glass. He had that practiced oily smile plastered on his face, the one he used for health inspectors and disgruntled VIPs. He didn't know he was walking toward his executioner. He thought he was walking toward a negotiation. "Good evening," Mason said, his voice smooth but tight. "My waiter tells me you're representing the new ownership group. I wasn't aware the building had been sold yet. I'm Mason White, the general manager." I didn't look up immediately. The waiter had just placed the risotto in front of me. I picked up my fork, swirling the creamy rice. It was stiff. It had been sitting under a heat lamp too long. "You switched to pre-grated Parmesan," I said softly, looking at the food. Mason blinked, his smile faltering. "Excuse me." "The risotto," I continued, finally cutting a bite. "And you stopped using the imported arborio. This is domestic, starchy, cheap." I put the fork in my mouth. It tasted like mediocrity. It tasted like a restaurant that had stopped caring. "Sir, with all due respect," Mason said, his tone sharpening with irritation. "Our risotto is a signature dish. If you have a complaint about the food, I can comp it, but I'm here to discuss the building. You didn't answer my question about the Parmesan, Mason?" I slowly lifted my head. I leaned forward out of the shadows of the booth, the overhead pendant light finally hitting my face. I locked eyes with him. "Did you think nobody would notice the difference?" Mason froze. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a physical blow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He squinted, his brain struggling to reconcile the bearded, bespoke-suited man before him with the line cook he had betrayed 5 years ago. Jake," he whispered. It was a sound of pure disbelief. At that moment, Savannah appeared at his elbow. She had likely seen his distress from across the room and come to rescue him. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, putting a hand on Mason's arm. Then she followed Mason's gaze to me. Her reaction was visceral. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She took a stumbling step back, bumping into the empty chair. "Hello, Savannah," I said. My voice was calm, conversational. "You look tired." "This isn't possible," Mason stammered, gripping the edge of the table. You left. You were gone." I agreed. "And while I was gone, I learned a few things. I learned that loyalty is expensive, but real estate is priceless." I reached into my inner coat pocket. Mason flinched as if he expected a weapon. In a way, it was. I pulled out a folded document, the deed of trust transfer Sarah had finalized that morning. I slid it across the table right next to the bowl of cold risotto. "Chen Capital acquired the debt on this building at 9 a.m. today," I said. "I am the managing partner in charge of the asset, which means, Mason, I am your landlord." The silence that followed was deafening. The restaurant noise around us seemed to fade away. They stood there, the adulterous wife and the treacherous friend, stripped of their power. They weren't the manager and the supervisor anymore. They were tenants, and I was the eviction notice. You own the building," Savannah whispered, her eyes wide, scanning my face for any trace of the husband who used to rub her feet after a long shift. She found none. "I own the ground you're standing on," I corrected. "And frankly, based on this risotto, the value of the property is the only thing this place has going for it." Mason tried to rally. He tried to find some footing. "Jake, look, the past, what happened, it was complicated. But business is business. We run a profitable ship here. If you're the owner, you need us. We know the operations." I picked up my napkin and dabbed my mouth, though I hadn't eaten more than a bite. "Profitable?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I've seen the books, Mason. You're bleeding cash. Food costs are up 12%. Liquor inventory's missing. And now I know why." I gestured to the cheap risotto. "You're stealing from the quality to pay for the lifestyle." I stood up. I towered over them now. "I'll be in the owner's office tomorrow at 8 a.m. to begin the audit," I said, buttoning my coat. "Don't be late," and Mason fixed the neon sign out front. "It's embarrassing." I walked past them without looking back, leaving them standing in shock. The manager's office at the Harbor View was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I had just grown used to spaces that commanded respect. When I walked in at 7:55 a.m., Mason was already there, hovering nervously by his desk. "Sit," I said, pointing to the cheap folding chair in the corner, usually reserved for disciplined bussers. I walked around the mahogany desk and sat in the high-backed leather executive chair. It creaked under my weight. It felt like a throne made of cardboard. Savannah stood by the door, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. She looked pale, the makeup under her eyes, unable to hide the sleepless night she must have had. "Let's look at the numbers," I said, opening the laptop I had brought with me. I didn't need their passwords. I had the master access codes from the acquisition transfer. For the next 2 hours, I dismantled their lives line by line. July 14th, I read from the spreadsheet, not looking up. 3 cases of Dom Perignon listed as spoilage, broken bottles. That's $1,200 of inventory. Care to explain how 3 cases shatter simultaneously? Mason cleared his throat, sweat beading on his forehead. "It was a delivery accident. The driver dropped them." "I checked the delivery manifest," I said, turning the screen toward him. "The driver signed off on a clean delivery. The breakage report was logged at 11:30 p.m. Funny time for a delivery accident. Coincidentally, that was the same night as your birthday, wasn't it?" Mason said nothing. He stared at his shoes. I turned to Savannah. "And you, the floor supervisor. Labor costs are through the roof on Tuesday nights. You have 6 servers clocked in for 40 covers. Why? We need the coverage," Savannah said, her voice trembling slightly. "Service standards. 2 of those servers are clocked in but have 0 table sales." I interrupted. "Ghost shifts. You're clocking in friends, or maybe you're padding hours for staff who kick back a percentage to you." "I would never," Savannah started, indignation rising in her voice. "Don't lie to me." I cut her off. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I know every trick in this building because I used to work the line while you two were busy managing in the walk-in freezer. The reference to the freezer hit them like a physical slap. Savannah flinched. Mason went rigid. Jake, look, Mason said, his voice cracking. We can fix this. We can pay back the discrepancies. Just don't bring the police into this. The reputation of the restaurant. The reputation is already dead, I said. You killed it with mediocrity. I leaned back in the chair, steepling my fingers. This was the moment. I could fire them right now. I could call the cops for embezzlement. But that was too easy. That was too quick. I'm not going to fire you, I said. They both looked up, hope flickering in their terrified eyes. Not yet, I added, because I need someone to manage the transition. And frankly, I want to see if you can actually work. I tossed a thick binder onto the desk. This is the new operating protocol. Mason, you're going to scrub the kitchen, literally. I want the grease traps cleaned by hand tonight. Savannah, you're back on the floor, but not as supervisor. You're taking tables. Section 4, the one near the kitchen door. You can't be serious, Savannah whispered. I'm the floor manager. You're an employee of a failing asset, I corrected. And until I decide otherwise, you do what the owner says. Or you can quit and I'll hand this file of embezzled champagne and ghost shifts to the district attorney by lunch. The silence stretched thin. They were trapped. They couldn't leave without facing jail time, and they couldn't stay without facing humiliation. It was a prison of their own making. Fine, Mason whispered, his spirit breaking. I'll do the traps. Good, I said, opening my email. Now get out of my office. They shuffled out like scolded children. As the door clicked shut, I didn't feel a rush of joy. I felt a cold, grim satisfaction. I was turning the heat up degree by degree just to see how long they could last in the kitchen they had created. Friday night at the Harbor View was a chaotic ballet of noise, heat, and demand. From my vantage point at Table 4, which the staff now referred to as the owner's box, I watched the performance unfold. But this time the casting was different. Mason was no longer standing at the pass in a pristine suit barking orders. He was in the scullery. I could see him through the swinging doors every time a waiter passed through. He was wearing a plastic apron that was 3 sizes too small, wrestling with the industrial dishwasher. The steam had turned his face a blotchy red, and his expensive haircut was plastered to his forehead with sweat. Every time he had to scrape a plate of half-eaten food into the bin, I saw a little more of his soul die. On the floor, Savannah was drowning. I had assigned her Section 4, the tourist trap section, near the kitchen entrance, where the draft was worst and the tips were poorest. She was currently serving a table of 6 investment bankers who were already 3 bottles of wine deep and treating her like furniture. "Honey, where's that bread basket?" one of them shouted, snapping his fingers. Savannah flinched. She looked tired. Her feet, usually clad in designer heels, were in sensible black flats, but I could tell her arches were screaming. She rushed to the kitchen, her face a mask of held-back tears. I took a sip of my Pinot Noir. It was a cruel theater, I knew that. But 5 years ago, I had worked 14-hour shifts on a fractured ankle because Mason wouldn't let me leave early, while Savannah sat at the bar drinking martinis. The scales were simply balancing. Around 10 o'clock p.m., the rush subsided. I remained at my table going over the architectural renderings for the site. "Jake?" The voice was soft, hesitant. I didn't look up immediately. I finished making a note in the margin of the blueprint. "It's Mr. Montgomery during working hours, Savannah," I said, finally raising my eyes. She stood there holding a tray of dirty glasses. She looked stripped down. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, trembling vulnerability. "Mr. Montgomery," she corrected, her voice breaking, Can I talk to you for a second, please?" I gestured to the empty seat opposite me. "You have 2 minutes. You're still on the clock." She sat down, her hands fidgeting in her lap. She looked at me, really looked at me, searching for the husband she had discarded. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "If you hate us this much, just fire us. Why make us suffer?" "I don't hate you, Savannah," I said calmly. "Hate implies passion. I'm indifferent. I needed staff who knew the layout to manage the transition. You were available. And frankly, considering the debt you two are in, you need the paycheck." "It's not just the money," she said, leaning forward. Her hand moved across the table inches from mine. "I made a mistake, Jake. A terrible mistake. But we were young. We were struggling. Mason, he offered me a way out of the worry, but he's not you. He never was you. Her eyes filled with tears, perfect cinematic tears. I miss you. I miss us. The way you used to cook for me at 2 a.m., the way we used to dream about owning a house. Is there any part of you that still remembers that? I looked at her hand. 5 years ago, that hand reaching out would have brought me to my knees. I would have forgiven anything just to hold it. Now I felt nothing. It was like looking at a stranger's hand. I remember, I said. I remember working double shifts to buy you that ring you pawned. I remember the smell of the freezer. I remember the sound of you laughing at me while I was 10 feet away. I pulled my hand back out of her reach. The Jake you miss didn't exist, Savannah. He was a doormat you wiped your feet on before walking into Mason's office. The man sitting here, he's a businessman, and you're pitching a bad investment. She recoiled as if I had struck her. The hope in her eyes extinguished, leaving only cold reality. You're a monster, she hissed. No, I said, signaling the floor manager. I'm a landlord, and your break is over. She stood up, her face burning with humiliation, and grabbed her tray. As she walked away, her shoulders slumped. I looked back down at my blueprints. The rendering showed the property leveled flat, a blank canvas. Soon, I whispered to myself, very soon. For the next 2 weeks, the Harbor View operated with a frantic, terrified efficiency that it hadn't seen in a decade. Fear, it turned out, was a far better motivator than ambition. Mason was the first to arrive and the last to leave. He scrubbed the floors until his knees were bruised. He renegotiated with vendors, cutting costs with a ruthlessness I had never seen in him before. Savannah managed the floor with military precision, her smile tight, but her service impeccable. They were working like a team again, not a romantic team, but a survival unit. They were bonded by the shared thread of my presence. I watched it all from the shadows of my booth or through the lens of the security cameras in my office. It was fascinating. They truly believed that this was a test. They thought that if they jumped high enough, if they cleaned hard enough, the owner would be pleased and their little kingdom would be restored. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Mason knocked on my office door. He walked in holding a thick leather binder, followed by Savannah. They looked exhausted, but there was a spark of hope in their eyes. A dangerous thing, hope. Mr. Montgomery, Mason began, his voice steady for the first time since my return. We've prepared a proposal. He placed the binder on the desk. The cover read, Harbor View Revitalization Strategy, Q4 Forecast. We've cut food costs by 18%, Mason said, pointing to the charts. We've retrained the staff. Guest satisfaction scores are up. If we sustain this trajectory, we can return the restaurant to profitability within 3 months. Savannah chimed in, her tone eager. And we have ideas for a winter menu launch, a rebranding event. We can leverage the waterfront view for holiday parties. We just need you to sign off on the marketing budget. I didn't open the binder. I stared at the cover. You've done excellent work these past 2 weeks, I said quietly. Mason let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. Savannah's shoulders dropped, a tentative smile forming. Thank you, Jake. I mean, Mr. Montgomery. Mason said, a hint of his old confidence returning. We know we messed up. We got complacent. But we know this building. We know this business. We can make you a lot of money. Money, I repeated, tasting the word. You think this is about the P&L statement. Isn't it? Savannah asked, confused. You're a businessman. You bought a distressed asset. We're showing you how to fix it. I stood up and walked to the window. The rain was lashing against the glass, blurring the view of the Chicago River below. You're right, I said, my back to them. I am a businessman, and in business you have to know when an asset is toxic. But it's not toxic anymore, Mason argued, stepping forward. Look at the numbers. We fixed the leaks. We fixed the staff issues. I turned around slowly. You fixed the symptoms, Mason. You didn't fix the rot. I looked at the two of them, the best friend who stabbed me in the back and the wife who held the knife. They were standing there presenting me with spreadsheets and marketing plans, thinking that a few weeks of hard work could erase 5 years of silence. They thought they were negotiating for their jobs. They didn't realize they were standing in a graveyard. The revitalization plan is rejected, I said coldly. What? Why? Mason demanded, his frustration spiking. It's a solid plan. You're being irrational. I'm being entirely rational, I replied. I don't need a winter menu. I don't need a holiday party. I walked back to the desk and picked up a different document, a rolled-up architectural blueprint that had been sitting there all along. There is a mandatory all-staff meeting tomorrow night after service, I said. I want everyone there. Front of house, back of house, everyone. Is this about the relaunch? Savannah asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. I looked at her, and for the first time I allowed a flicker of the old pain to show in my eyes, just enough to unsettle her. It's about the future, I said. Be there, and wear your best clothes. It's going to be a night to remember. I dismissed them with a wave of my hand. As they left clutching their rejected binder, they looked less like saviors and more like ghosts haunting a house that had already been sold. They didn't know it yet, but the future I was talking about didn't include them. It didn't even include the building. The main dining room of the harbor view was silent save for the nervous shuffling of feet. 40 employees stood in a semicircle around the grand piano waiters line, cooks, bussers, and dishwashers. They looked anxious, whispering rumors about a rebranding or a new uniform policy. Mason and Savannah stood at the front, slightly apart from the crew, posturing as the lieutenants of this new regime. Mason had even polished his shoes. He gave a reassuring nod to the head chef, acting the part of the confident general manager. He still believed. He still thought this was a rescue mission. I walked in from the shadows of the hallway. I didn't take the small stage. I stood on the floor level right in front of them. I held a stack of white envelopes in my hand. Thank you all for coming, I said. My voice carried without shouting, the acoustic perfection of the room working in my favor. For the past month, I have observed the operations of this establishment. I continued, my eyes scanning the faces of the line cooks, young men with burn marks on their arms just like I used to have. I have seen hard work from many of you. I have seen dedication in the face of poor management and failing infrastructure. Mason stiffened, his smile freezing. However, I paused, letting the word hang in the heavy air. Some things cannot be fixed. Some foundations are too rotten to build upon. I took a step forward. Effective midnight tonight, the Harbor View restaurant will permanently cease operations. A collective gasp ripped through the room. Mason stepped forward, his face pale. Mr. Montgomery, Jake, wait, we have a plan, the Q4 forecast. I ignored him. I turned to the line cooks and the servers. This is not a reflection of your labor, I said, lifting the stack of envelopes. In these envelopes are severance packages, 3 months of full pay for every hourly employee, and for the kitchen staff, I have arranged interviews with the culinary director at the Palmer House. You will not be left out in the cold. The shock turned to relief, then gratitude. The staff murmured their thanks, taking the envelopes from my assistant. They filed out one by one, glancing back at Mason and Savannah with pity. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one, and they had just been given lifeboats. Finally, the room was empty. Just the three of us. The silence was louder than the noise had been. 3 months severance. Mason choked out, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and terror. You're just closing it. We turned a profit last week. This is insanity. You're throwing away a legacy. It's not a legacy, Mason, I said, walking slowly toward them. It's a crime scene. Ah, wait, what about us? Savannah stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. You gave the dishwashers 3 months' pay. What about us? We ran this place. You ran it into the ground, I corrected. And you don't get severance. You get nothing. You can't do this, Mason shouted, his fist clenching. We have rights. We have contracts. You can't just destroy our careers because of a grudge. It was 5 years ago, Jake. 5 years we were friends. Friends. I laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Friends don't screw their best friend's wife in a walk-in freezer while he's sweating on the line 10 feet away. The color drained from both of their faces. I didn't just see you that night, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I heard you. I heard you tell her that I had grease-trap ambition. I heard you laugh, Savannah. I heard the exact moment you decided I was worthless. I closed the distance between us until I was inches from Mason's face. He smelled of fear and cheap cologne. You wanted to be the big man, Mason. You wanted the office. You wanted the girl. You got them. And look what you did with them. You embezzled. You lied. You stagnated. I turned to Savannah. She was sobbing openly now, her hands covering her mouth. And you, Savannah, you wanted a winner. You bet on the guy in the suit because you didn't think the guy in the apron could give you the world. I spread my arms, gesturing to the empty, silent restaurant. Well, I own the world now, and I'm evicting you from it. Please, Savannah begged, reaching for my sleeve. Jake, please. We have debt. We have nowhere to go. If you close this place, we lose everything. You lost everything the moment you opened that freezer door, I said, pulling my arm away. It just took you 5 years to realize it. I turned my back on them and walked toward the exit. Get your things, I said over my shoulder. Security is waiting to escort you out. The demolition crew arrives at dawn. Demolition! Mason whispered, the finality of the word crushing him. I didn't answer. I pushed through the double doors, leaving them standing in the center of the empire they had stolen, realizing too late that it was made of glass, and I was holding the hammer. The sun rose over the Chicago River like a bruised purple and cold. It was 6 a.m. The air was filled with the guttural roar of diesel engines and the beep, beep, beep of heavy machinery backing up. I stood on the pavement across the street holding a cup of black coffee. I was wearing my charcoal wool coat, the collar turned up against the wind. Beside me stood the foreman of the demolition crew, a man named Kowalski, who reminded me of who I used to be. Rough hands, tired eyes, honest work. We're ready when you are, Mr. Montgomery, Kowalski said, shouting over the idle rumble of the excavator. Permits are cleared, utilities are cut. We start with the facade. Do it, I said. I watched as the massive yellow arm of the excavator swung through the air. The metal claw hesitated for a moment, hovering over the red brick sign that read, The Harbor View. Then with a hydraulic hiss, it lunged. The sound was sickening and satisfying all at once. The crunch of timber, the shatter of glass, the groan of steel giving way. The V that had been flickering for years was the first thing to fall shattering on the concrete below. A small crowd had gathered behind the yellow caution tape, mostly curious joggers and early commuters. But at the edge of the perimeter, pressed against the chain-link fence, were two figures I knew better than my own reflection. Mason and Savannah. They hadn't left. They were standing there shivering in the morning chill, watching their kingdom turn to dust. Mason looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his shoulders hunched, his hands deep in the pockets of a coat that suddenly looked too big. Savannah was crying, not the pretty tears of manipulation, but the ugly, silent tears of total loss. They saw me. I knew they saw me. I stood on the other side of the street, untouchable, the architect of their ruin. The excavator tore into the south wall. That was where the kitchen was. I watched as the claw ripped through the siding, exposing the stainless steel skeletons of the prep tables. Then it reached deeper toward the back. The heavy steel door of the walk-in freezer hung in the air for a moment, suspended by a single hinge exposed to the morning light. It looked pathetic. Just a piece of metal. Just a room. Crunch. The machine crushed it effortlessly. The sanctuary of their betrayal, the place where they had mocked my grease-trap ambition, was reduced to scrap metal in seconds. The sunlight flooded the space where the shadows used to be. I felt a weight lift off my chest, a physical release, so intense it almost made me dizzy. The ghost of the line cook wasn't haunting the kitchen anymore. He was gone, buried under the bricks. Sarah Chen's car pulled up to the curb. She lowered the window, looking at the destruction with a critical, approving eye. Prime real estate, she said, nodding at the pile of debris. The new high-rise is going to have a hell of a view. It will, I agreed. You kept the land, but you destroyed the cash flow, she noted, looking at me. Was it worth it? The acquisition cost the demolition fees. Purely from a financial standpoint, it's a loss for this quarter. I looked at the rubble. Then I looked at Mason and Savannah, who were now walking away, heads down, fading into the gray city like background extras in someone else's movie. They had no restaurant to manage, no staff to command, no status. They were just two people who had bet against the wrong man. It wasn't a loss, Sarah, I said, turning my back on the dust cloud. It was an expense. The cost of doing business. I pulled back the sleeve of my coat and checked my watch. It was a Patek Philippe, heavy and cold against my wrist. The hands read 10:30 a.m. 5 years ago, this was the exact time I would be prepping the line, tying my apron, worrying about the lunch rush, worrying about making enough tips to pay the electric bill. I watched the second hand sweep past the 12. I didn't have to prep the line. I didn't have to serve anyone. I dropped the empty coffee cup into a trash can. The sound was final. "Let's go," I said to Sarah, opening the car door. "We have a meeting at noon to discuss the new foundation." As the car pulled away, I didn't look back at the ruin of the harbor view. I looked forward at the skyline of Chicago, a city that finally respected me, not because I cooked its food, but because I owned its stone.